A woman is thrust onto an auction platform in broad daylight, not as merchandise, not as a slave, but no one in the crowd dares to speak up. The entire town watches in silence. Her father's debt has been falsified. Her freedom is about to be sold. And only the most dangerous man on the frontier dares to step forward, not out of kindness, but for a deeper reason unknown to the town. Like, comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The auction started at 9:30 in the morning, which was early even by Red Mesa Crossing's standards. Most days, the town's main street was a slow, dusty corridor of commerce. A feed store, a hardware supply, the telegraph office with its peeling paint, two saloons that kept the peace by staying on opposite ends of the block. People moved through it with the particular unhurried rhythm of those who had learned that urgency rarely paid off in borderland country. The heat discouraged speed. The terrain discouraged ambition. And the syndicate, in the 18 months since Colton Varr had planted his operation in the region, had discouraged most everything else. But that Thursday morning, close to 300 people had gathered on the main street, and not one of them was moving at all. They stood packed shoulder to shoulder along both sides of the road, ranchers and shop owners, washerwomen still holding their laundry, miners on their way to the eastern ridgeline who had stopped and not continued. A handful of children had climbed the fence rails in front of the livery stable. The town's two deputies stood near the far end of the crowd, with their thumbs hooked in their belts, watching without watching, the way men watch something they have already decided not to interfere with. On the raised platform in front of the land registry office, a man named Driscoll was reading from a printed ledger in a loud, flat voice. Outstanding claim against the estate of one Thomas Voss, deceased, in the amount of $412, accrued interest included, as registered with the Western Territorial Land and Credit Syndicate, Colton Varr, principal holder. I already told you the paperwork is wrong. The voice came from a young woman standing on the platform 2 feet to Driscoll's left. Her wrists were not bound. The syndicate's men had learned enough about optics to avoid that. But there were 2 of them standing directly behind her, and the implicit message was the same. She was not there voluntarily. Her name was Elara Voss. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, built like someone who had spent her entire life doing physical work, which she had. Her father's homestead sat 6 miles south of town on the edge of a dry creek bed that ran full every spring, and she had been managing it alone since Thomas Voss died of a chest fever the previous October. She wore a plain gray work shirt and trousers, and the only thing on her face that could be called composed was the angle of her jaw, because her eyes were burning. The paperwork is what it is, Driscoll said, not looking up. My father borrowed $80 from the Red Mesa Credit Union in 1887. I have the original note. There is no $400 debt, and there is no interest claim that adds up to anything close to... Miss Voss. Driscoll finally looked at her, and his expression carried the particular patience of a man who was very confident in his position. The Red Mesa Credit Union was absorbed by the syndicate in March of last year. Outstanding debts transferred with the acquisition. The interest assessment is within the terms of the original contract, and if you would like to dispute the arithmetic, I'm not disputing the arithmetic. I'm disputing whether the debt exists at all. Driscoll closed the ledger. That's a matter for the territorial court. Then postpone the sale until the court date is 4 months out. The debt is due today. He turned back to the crowd, and Elara stood very still on the platform with both of Varr's men at her back, and she looked out at 300 people who all knew exactly what was happening, and not one of whom was going to do anything about it. She had known most of these people her entire life. Old Cal Brennan from the feed store had bought grain from her father for 15 years. Martha Price, who ran the laundry 2 streets over, had sat with Elara's mother through a bad winter when Elara was 7. The Okafor brothers, Levi and Samuel, had helped Thomas Voss repair his fencing after the floods of '89, and Thomas had done the same for them the following year without being asked. They all watched her now like they were looking at something they could not help. And maybe they couldn't. That was the thing about what Varr had built. It had been assembled carefully, one pressure point at a time, until the weight of it was so distributed through every piece of local commerce and law that there was no single piece you could push against without everything else pushing back. Driscoll was speaking again. The estate of Thomas Voss, being unable to satisfy the outstanding claim, is hereby subject to forfeit under Territorial Debt Resolution Statute. The primary asset being the homestead property at... The property is not the only asset. Driscoll paused. One of Vare's men, the taller one with a red mustache, said something quietly to Alara that the crowd couldn't hear. She didn't move. Under the statute, Driscoll continued, adjusting his collar, all assets belonging to the estate are subject to claim. That includes... He checked the ledger again, a gesture that felt performed. The property, equipment, livestock, and any outstanding labor obligations attached to the estate's operation. Labor obligations. That was the language they were using. Alara had known it was coming. She had known from the moment Driscoll showed up at her door 3 weeks ago with the paperwork. She had ridden to town that same afternoon and talked to every person she thought might help. Judge Alcott, who was currently unavailable due to an unspecified illness. Her father's old friend Pete Danner, who told her quietly that he couldn't get involved. The territory's circuit lawyer, who informed her that taking a case against Var would require a retainer she did not have. She had known, and she had prepared anyway, because that was the only thing she could think to do. She had collected her father's original loan documents. She had gone through every piece of paper in the homestead's back office, every receipt and contract and note in her father's cramped handwriting. She had found 3 other families in the area who had received the same inflated debt notices, and she had written down their names and dates in a small leather notebook she kept in her shirt pocket. None of it had been enough to stop this morning from arriving. Driscoll was opening the bidding. Labor claim against the estate, term of service to satisfy outstanding debt. We will open at $50. Someone in the crowd coughed. A horse shifted somewhere down the street. The 2 deputies continued watching without watching. Alara looked at the faces in front of her and tried to find one that might still change its mind, and found none. She was calculating, not panicking, she was past that, but calculating whether there was anything she had not yet tried, any move she had not made. The leather notebook in her pocket felt heavier than it was. 3 families, 14 fraudulent debt notices she had tracked down in total across 3 counties. A pattern she had documented carefully and completely, and which was about to become irrelevant because she would no longer be free to do anything with it. The bidding had reached $80. One of Vare's own men was doing the bidding, which meant the whole thing was a performance. Vare already knew what he was paying, had already decided what he wanted Alara for, which was to make an example. A visible, public, undeniable example of what happened to people who disputed syndicate debt claims. She was trying to think about the notebook, about the evidence, about whether there was anyone she could pass it to before the shot stopped everything. Not a gunshot, exactly. What she heard first was the sound of hooves, fast, too fast for a main street. And then a single gunshot fired into the air, not at anyone, just up, like a period at the end of a sentence. The crowd split. People moved sideways and backward in a wave, and through the gap they opened came a horse moving at a dead canter, a gray-brown quarter horse with a dark mane and a rider who pulled it to a stop in the open space directly in front of the auction platform with a particular kind of control that looked effortless and wasn't. The rider didn't dismount. He sat in the saddle and looked at the platform, and the crowd looked at him, and nobody said anything for a moment that felt longer than it was. Alara had never seen Rhett Maddox in person. She had heard the name, everyone in 4 counties had heard the name, but the stories that circulated about him tended toward the theatrical, and she had assumed most of them were exaggerated in the way that stories about dangerous men usually were, the kind of exaggeration that said more about the fears of the people telling the story than about the man himself. Looking at him now, she revised that assumption slightly. He was perhaps 30, perhaps older. It was hard to tell with men who spent their lives outdoors. Lean, dark-complexioned, wearing a duster that had seen serious weather. The hat was pulled low enough that you had to work to see his eyes. But when you did, they were a particular flat gray that communicated an absence of urgency she found almost more unsettling than aggression would have been. There was a rifle in the saddle scabbard on his right side. He had a revolver holstered on his left. Neither was drawn. He looked at Driscoll. "You're a long way from Var's office," he said. Driscoll stiffened. "This is a legal proceeding under territorial. I know what it is." Rhett's voice was not loud. It carried anyway. I'm asking why you're doing it on a public street in the middle of the morning instead of in a courthouse. The court is unavailable. Yeah. He looked at the crowd for a moment, then back at the platform. Judge Alcott's been unavailable for about 3 weeks now. Funny how that lines up. One of Vare's men, not the tall one with the red mustache, a different one, broader and standing at the edge of the platform, took a step forward. You got business here, Maddox, or you just passing through? Still figuring that out. The man's hand moved toward his belt. Rhett's eyes moved to him. Just moved. Nothing else. And the man's hand stopped. Here's the thing, Rhett said, addressing Driscoll again, about debt claims under territorial statute. There's a provision, been on the books since about '82, most people don't know it's there, that says if a disputed claim can be shown to be fraudulent within 30 days of the collection action, the entire proceeding is void, including any sale or transfer that occurred during that period. He paused. You knew that? Driscoll's jaw moved. Any such fraud claim would need to be brought to the court, which is unavailable. Rhett nodded. Right. Except the statute doesn't specify the court. It says before a legal officer of the territory, which includes a U.S. Marshal. He looked out at the crowd again, and this time he let it sit for a second. I rode through Coyote Fork 2 days ago. Marshal Thibodeau is on his way east, going to pass within about 15 miles of here. I could send for him. You have no standing to... I'm not claiming standing. He looked at Driscoll evenly. I'm making a practical observation. You proceed with this sale today, and in 30 days the whole thing comes apart because the debt is fraudulent, which it is, and then you've got a federal marshal looking at everyone who participated. He let that land. Or you pause the proceeding. Give the 30 days. He glanced at Alara for the first time, a quick assessment, and she found herself resenting both its brevity and the fact that it was accurate. Let the woman keep her freedom while the claim gets examined. Silence. Alara was watching him. So was everyone else. She could see from where she was standing that the deputies at the far end had shifted their weight, which was either discomfort or readiness, and she wasn't sure which. Driscoll said carefully, and if the claim is not shown to be fraudulent within 30 days, then it stands, and you proceed. Rhett's expression didn't change. I'll ride with her. Make sure she doesn't disappear. There was a sound from somewhere in the crowd that might have been a laugh and might have been a cough. Driscoll looked at the platform behind him, at the 2 syndicate men. A look passed between them that Alara couldn't fully read. Mr. Varr, Driscoll said carefully, will want to discuss... Mr. Varr can discuss it with Marshal Thibodeau if he prefers. Rhett adjusted his weight in the saddle with the ease of someone who had nowhere else to be. Your call. Done. It took another 20 minutes for Driscoll to agree. He didn't like it. He consulted with Varr's men twice, in a huddled conversation at the back of the platform that Alara could not hear, but could read well enough from the body language. One of the men wanted to push back harder, and the other was less sure. The presence of a federal marshal, even a theoretical one 15 miles away, introduced a variable they hadn't planned for, and Alara watched Driscoll weigh that variable against the public setting and the crowd and the man on the horse who was still sitting there with that flat gray patience, and she saw the moment Driscoll made his decision. 30 days, Driscoll announced, addressing the crowd. The proceeding is postponed pending examination of the debt claim. The estate remains under syndicate lien during this period. He looked at Alara with something that was almost professional. You're not free to transfer or sell property. I wasn't planning on it, she said. The platform cleared in a way that felt slightly too fast. Vara's men left without making eye contact with her. The crowd started to disperse slower, with the restless, unsatisfied energy of people who had assembled for a spectacle and gotten something more ambiguous. Alara stepped down from the platform and walked to where Rhett's horse was standing. He was already watching her when she looked up. That provision you cited, she said, the 30-day statute. What about it? Is it real? He looked at her for a moment. It's real. And the marshal? Thibodeau? Passes through this corridor about 3 times a year. He's due. He paused. Probably. Probably, she repeated. I didn't say probably to Driscoll. No, she said. You didn't. She studied him for a moment, trying to get a read on a face that was doing its considerable best not to be read. Why did you stop it? He didn't answer immediately. He looked past her at the space where the platform had been, at the dispersing crowd, at the registry office with its closed door. I was riding through, he said finally. You fired a gun in the air on a crowded main street. Got their attention. That's not an answer. He looked at her directly for the first time without the assessment quality, and she found that he had a way of holding eye contact that was neither warm nor cold, but simply level, like he was deciding something. You've got 30 days, he said. What do you have so far? She pulled the leather notebook from her shirt pocket and held it out. He didn't take it. He leaned down from the saddle and looked at it in her hand, opening the cover with one finger, scanning the first few pages. When he looked up, something in his expression had shifted. Not softened, more like focused. Where'd you get all this? I put it together myself over the last 3 weeks. She held his gaze. There are 14 families in this, maybe more. The syndicate's been working this pattern for at least 2 years. They acquire local credit institutions, then inflate existing debts under the acquisition terms. The debtors don't find out until collection starts, by which point VAR's already got the territorial court in his pocket. Judge Alcott, and at least one deputy circuit clerk, I think, based on the recording dates. She paused. The records have gaps that shouldn't be there, recorded instruments that don't match the originals. I need access to the actual registry archive, not just the public copies. He closed the notebook and she took it back. That archive, he said, is in VAR's land office in Harlan County. I know where it is. It's 2 days' ride, through country he controls. I know that too. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, You planned this. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. I planned everything I could, which was everything except stopping the sale. She held his gaze. You did that part. Yeah, he exhaled. I did. There was a pause, and in the pause she could hear the town reestablishing its ordinary noise around them. A door closing, a horse cart moving, someone's voice in the feed store. If I ride with you, he said, it's not charity. I need something from the archive, too. What? Land title records going back to 1884, property in the Northern Valley, registered under a name. He stopped. I'll explain when we get there. She looked at him. He was clearly not going to say more than that. All right. You ride? My father's land is 6 miles south of here on a dry creek that runs through 3 canyons. I've ridden since I was 4. He almost smiled. She was fairly sure of it, though it came and went too quickly to be certain. Be ready at first light. We'll go south first. Get your things, then east. I'll be ready. She started to turn away, then looked back. I don't actually know anything about you, except the name. You know enough. I know you're wanted in 2 counties. I know you broke a man's arm in a gambling dispute in Coyote Fork last spring. I know the syndicate has a paper on you, too. Something about a land claim in the Northern Valley that they moved against about a year ago. She watched his face. Nothing moved. Which explains the title records. He looked at her for a long moment. You put this together in 3 weeks, he said. I told you. I prepared everything I could. This time the almost smile was less almost. Get your things packed, he said. 1 bag. Bring the notebook. She rode out of town before noon to avoid further conversation with people who had watched her stand on that platform and done nothing. She needed to be moving, needed to be doing something with her hands, and the familiar path south along the creek road helped with that. The homestead was 6 years of her parents' work, and 2 of her own since her mother died. A main house, a barn in reasonable repair, a tool shed, 3 horses, and 30 acres of mixed grazing and garden land that managed to produce enough that she'd never gone hungry, which in borderland country counted as success. Her father's name was carved into the gatepost at the entry road, Thomas E. Voss, 1881, and she had never been able to look at it without a complicated feeling she had no clean name for. Inside she packed quickly and deliberately. Change of clothes, rain gear, the original loan documents in a waterproof oilcloth sleeve, her own revolver, a .38 that she could shoot accurately at reasonable distance, which was a practical skill, not a dramatic one. The leather notebook, a small folding knife, 3 days of food. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment after packing, looking at the room. The window faced east and the afternoon light came in at a low angle, and the whole room looked briefly like it was made of amber, and she thought about her father in a way she usually kept behind a door she didn't open. He had been a careful man, methodical. Not particularly warm, but not unkind. The kind of man who showed affection through practical acts, who told her she was smart by pointing out when she had reasoned correctly, and who told her he trusted her by asking her opinion about things that mattered. He had taught her to read a contract before he taught her to ride, and he had told her once, when she was maybe 15, that the most dangerous document in the world was an agreement you signed without understanding. She wondered what he would have made of the notebook in her pocket, of the evidence she'd assembled. He would have approved of the method. He would have worried about the situation. She picked up her bag and walked out of the house. Rhett Maddox arrived at the homestead gate at first light the following morning, as promised, leading a pack horse with provisions and bedroll. He looked at the gatepost carving when he came through. She saw him look at it, but said nothing. She was waiting in front of the barn with her bag and her horse, a bay mare named Cursa, who had strong feet and a bad temper toward strangers, and who expressed this by laying her ears back when Rhett's horse came close. "She bites," Alara said. "So does mine." He looked at the house, then back at her. "You lock up?" "Nobody's going to bother it while Var thinks the lien is holding," she mounted. "The moment that changes, a locked door isn't going to stop anything anyway." He considered this. "Fair." He turned his horse east. "We go to Ridger's Cut first. Pick up a map from a man I know there." "What man?" "Someone who knows the back routes into Harlan County that don't go through the main passes." He paused. "Someone who won't advertise that he helped us." "Does he owe you?" "I did him a favor once." "What kind of favor?" "The kind he doesn't talk about." He glanced at her. "You always this many questions?" "Generally, yes." He looked ahead. "Good to know." They rode east into the early morning, the light still gray and low, the desert floor stretching out in its particular silence that was not quite stillness, insects somewhere, and the dry whisper of wind through brush, and the sound of hooves on packed earth that had its own rhythm once you stopped hearing it and just moved with it. She had been on this road before, the eastern route, but usually not past the canyon junction at mile 17. Past that point it was syndicate-adjacent territory, which meant you could ride it, but you were aware of being seen, aware of the invisible ownership of the landscape around you that Var had established through deed and intimidation over the past 2 years. She watched Rhett from her peripheral vision as they rode. He was an uncomfortable person to be around, but not in the way she had expected. She had expected volatile. The stories were about violence, about temper, about a man who solved problems with force. What she found instead was a silence that was not hostility, but that was not comfortable either, like sitting next to a door that you know opens onto something unpleasant, even when it's closed. She asked, "How long have you known about the syndicate's pattern?" He took a moment to answer, which was a habit she was starting to catalog. "About as long as you have, give or take." "The land claim in the Northern Valley, when did they come against it?" 14 months ago." A pause. "The property was my mother's, left to me. The debt claim they filed was for a loan my mother never took out. I have the original bank records, and there's no corresponding note. It was manufactured from nothing." Another pause. "I went to the court. Alcott threw it out in under an hour. I went to the territorial marshal's office in the capital. The man I spoke to told me he'd look into it. I rode back 3 weeks later and he'd been reassigned." "That's when you started looking at it yourself." "That's when I started looking." He looked at the horizon. "I found the pattern. Not as thoroughly as you did. Your notebook's more complete than anything I'd put together, but enough to know it was bigger than my piece of it." "So you knew when you came to Red Mesa Crossing yesterday?" "I knew about the sale. Somebody in Coyote Fork had heard about it, mentioned your name, mentioned the date." He kept his eyes forward. "I wasn't sure I was going to stop it. I hadn't decided." "What decided you?" A long pause. The fact that 300 people were just standing there, he said, and the flatness of his voice said more about his feelings on the subject than any expression would have. Alara looked at the road ahead. It wasn't cowardice, with most of them. I know what it was. They have families, debt claims of their own. They'd spoken up. I know why they didn't. Turned to look at her. That doesn't make it any less of a problem. She thought about that. No, she said. It doesn't. They rode without talking for a while after that. The canyon walls rose to the north, red and orange layered in the morning light, and Cursa had settled into her road pace, which was efficient and unhurried, and Alara's mind was running through the notebook, through the gaps in the evidence, through what they needed from the Harlan County Archive and how they were going to get it. The archive, she said. Is it accessible, or is it inside VAR's operation? It's in the county land office, technically public record. He paused, but VAR has a man there, clerk named Hodges. Any request for older instruments goes through him, and if the name means anything to him, the records are suddenly unavailable. So we can't go in as ourselves. Not directly. What's the approach? He was quiet for a moment. I know a woman in Harlan who does copying work, legal transcription. She's had access to the archive before, legitimate work above board. She owes me a different kind of favor than the man in Ridger's Cut. You have a lot of people who owe you favors. I've been at this for 14 months, he said. You collect things along the way. Have any of those people helped because they wanted to, rather than because they owed you? He thought about it. One or two? He glanced at her. Why? Because people who help out of obligation help you once, she said. People who help because they believe in something help you more than once. He didn't answer that. She didn't push it. They reached the canyon junction at mid-morning, and Rhett turned them north without explanation, up a trail that was barely a trail, more like a gap between rock formations that happened to be consistently wide enough for a horse. Cursa disliked it and said so with a head toss. Alara let her work through it. The trail climbed for a quarter mile and then leveled onto a broad, flat shelf of red rock with a view of the eastern plain that took her breath slightly, the way landscape sometimes does when you come on it unexpectedly. She stopped to let Cursa breathe and looked out at it for a moment. Ridger's Cut is another 2 miles north, Rhett said. I know. I've been looking at that view. He stopped his horse beside her. They sat together looking east in silence, and the wind came up off the plain and moved through the space between them. The map we're picking up, she said. It gets us into Harlan without going through Vara's checkpoints? There are 3 routes. The main pass is watched. Vara has men stationed there after trouble with some cattle rustlers last fall, and they check everyone. There's a secondary route through the red breaks that's technically passable but hard on horses, and you'd need to camp at elevation for 2 nights. He pointed slightly southeast. And there's a third route through a private land corridor. Old ranching family. They don't like Var. Who are they? Callahan, father and 3 sons. Oldest son, Henry, is the one I helped in Coyote Fork. The arm I broke was someone else's, someone who owed Henry money and was making it a physical conversation. You broke someone's arm to help a debt collection? The debt was legitimate. The method the other man was using wasn't. He looked at her. I have a hierarchy. She studied his face. I believe you, she said, and she meant it, and she could tell from the slight change in his expression that he had not entirely expected that. They rode on. Ridger's Cut was a collection of 4 buildings and a horse pen tucked into a notch in the canyon wall, the kind of place that existed in borderland country as a way station without ambitions, and the man who met them in front of the largest building was Henry Callahan, who was perhaps 40, weathered, with the particular directness of someone who had learned that small talk was mostly a waste of everyone's time in conditions that required actual decisions. He looked at Rhett without surprise and at Alara with a measuring look that was not unfriendly. I heard about Red Mesa, he said. Then you know why we're here, Rhett said. Henry looked at Alara again. You the Voss woman? Alara, she said. Yes. He nodded. Your father traded with my family some, years back. Decent man. He turned and went inside without further ceremony, and they followed, and he pulled a rolled map from a flat tin box under a work table and spread it out. The route through the Callahan Land corridor was marked in pencil, with notes in a small, precise hand about water sources and campsites, and two specific fences that would need to be opened and closed. Henry walked them through it without flourish, correcting one notation that was outdated and adding two new ones. Vares had men on the main pass for 3 weeks now, he said. They're running papers on everyone coming east. If they see your name, he looked at Rhett, it'll go badly. I know. What's your play in the archive? Records going back to '84, title history, and original transfer instruments. Henry's expression shifted. You found something. She found something, Rhett said, and Alara felt the clarity of the correction, the fact that he hadn't taken credit. Henry looked at her. What did you find? A pattern, she said. 14 families. Inflated debt claims on transferred credit accounts. But the archive will have the original instruments, the baseline records before the syndicate acquired the local credit institutions. If the numbers don't match, and I believe they won't, that's documentary fraud. Enough for a federal case. Henry was quiet for a moment, and then he said, There's a family 2 valleys over, the Delgados. They had a claim made against them 4 months back, lost the property. He looked at the map. My youngest son wanted to do something about it. I told him to wait. Tell him to keep waiting, Rhett said. 30 more days. Can you actually pull this off? I don't know, Alara said, because it was the honest answer. Henry looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Rhett, and something passed between them that was recognition of some kind. Take the northern entry, Henry said, putting his finger on the map. The gate combination is my father's birth year. You'll know the fence when you see it. There's a red cloth tied to the post. He folded the map and held it out to Alara, not to Rhett, which was a deliberate choice. My family will know you're coming through. Nobody else will. She took the map. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. Just come back with something that holds up. They camped that night in a shallow overhang at the southern edge of the canyon system, far enough from the main routes that firelight wasn't a risk. Alara cooked over a small flame, dried beef and hard bread, and the strong, slightly bitter coffee that trail conditions produced regardless of intent. Rhett sat across the fire from her, doing something to his rifle that involved small tools and focused attention, and they didn't talk for most of it, but the silence was different from the morning silence, less like a closed door and more like an occupied room. The archive, she said, when they had both eaten and the fire was low. What if Hodges the clerk is there when we arrive? Then we don't go in directly. He set the rifle aside. There's a back entrance to the land office through the surveyor's annex next door. The surveyor himself isn't involved with Vare. He's an old man named Fitch, who mostly just wants to be left alone. He lets the transcription woman in through his space sometimes when the main office is occupied. The transcription woman, she knows we're coming? I sent word from Ridger's Cut, through Henry. He looked at her across the fire. Her name is Dell. She's careful and she's fast. She can copy a document accurately in a quarter of the time it takes most people. How do you know her? He was quiet for a moment. She used to live in the Northern Valley, neighboring property to my mother's place. Another pause. When the syndicate came against my mother's land, they came against Dell's too. She lost hers. Alara held his gaze. So she has her own reason. Yeah. Good, she said. That's the kind of help that holds. He looked at the fire. You said that before, about people helping because they believe in something. I meant it both times. He was quiet. The fire made small sounds. Far out in the desert, something called once and went silent. When Driscoll read out that debt this morning, he said, and the town just stood there. You didn't break. Most people would have broken. She looked at the fire. I thought about it. That's not the same thing. No, she said. I suppose it's not. She turned the notebook over in her hands without opening it. I kept thinking about the other 14 families, that if this worked, if they actually went through with it, there would be a public record of it, of how it happened, in front of 300 witnesses, and that was either evidence or it was a warning, and I didn't know which, and I was trying to figure out which would be more useful. He stared at her. You were standing on an auction platform about to lose your freedom, and you were thinking about evidentiary strategy. I was also scared, she said flatly. You can do both. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do yet. He laughed. It was brief, and it didn't change his face much, but it was genuine. Yeah, he said. You can. She put the notebook in her bag and lay down on her bedroll, and after a minute she heard him settle on his side of the fire, and the desert was quiet around them, and she thought about the 30 days they had and what was in the archive, and the routes through the Callahan corridor, and she did not think about the fact that the homestead was 6 miles west and unlocked and alone, because that was not useful. She thought about her father's handwriting in the original loan note. $80. The neat, careful numbers. She thought about what Rhett had said about Alcott throwing out his case in under an hour. She thought about Driscoll's face when he said 30 days, and the look he exchanged with Var's men, and the calculation she had seen in it. 30 days was not very long. She went to sleep. They were through this Callahan corridor by mid-morning of the second day. The gate combination worked, her father's birth year, Henry had said, and the lock turned on the first try. And they moved through the narrow land passage without incident, the red cloth on the fence post exactly where the map said it would be. The second gate already standing open as though someone had come ahead and left it that way without making a point of it. One of the Callahan sons, she guessed. The kind of help that asked for nothing in return except that you close the gate behind you. The Red Breaks country east of the corridor was different from anything she had ridden through before. The canyon land she knew from home had a particular color logic. The red and orange of iron-heavy stone, the pale yellow of softer sediment, the occasional white outcropping that caught light in the afternoon and held it. This terrain was darker, older-looking, the rock faces cut into formations that seemed less like landscape and more like something that had collapsed a long time ago and never been sorted out. The trail wound through it in a way that felt improvised rather than intentional, like it had been made by animals that knew where they were going and didn't care if anyone else could follow. Cursa picked her way through without complaint, which Ilara noted as a good sign. The mare was a better reader of terrain than most people she had ridden with. Rhett navigated from memory more than from the map, which told her he had been through this country before, though she didn't ask when. There were things he volunteered and things he didn't, and she was building a rough taxonomy of which was which. He talked about logistics without hesitation, routes, timing, the people they were going to see. He talked about the syndicate's pattern when she pushed on a specific detail. He did not talk about his mother's land in the Northern Valley or about the 14 months he had spent working towards something he hadn't been able to reach on his own. She understood the shape of it. She didn't press. By early afternoon, they came down out of the breaks and onto the flatter approach to Harlan County, and the town of Harlan itself was visible in the middle distance, a low cluster of buildings against the pale dust of the plain. Dell's place is on the western edge, Rhett said, before the main street. Does she know what we're looking for specifically? She knows we need title records from 84 onward. I gave her the property names in my message. He paused. She may have already made a preliminary pass. Without us? Dell doesn't wait for people to catch up. It's a quality. He glanced at her. You'll like her. You don't know that. No, he admitted. But you're both the kind of person who figures things out before they're asked to. Ilara said nothing to that, but she filed it. Dell's house was a small adobe building set back from the road behind a stand of dry scrub that served as a windbreak. There was a wagon outside with a canvas cover, 2 horses in a lean-to pen, and smoke from a chimney that smelled like wood smoke and ink, which was a combination Ilara had not encountered before. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 50, lean and angular with close-cropped gray hair and reading spectacles pushed up on her forehead. She looked at Rhett with the expression of someone who was both genuinely glad to see a person and prepared to be annoyed by them. You're late, she said. We took the long way. I know. Henry sent word. She looked at Ilara with a sharper attention. You're the one who put together the notebook. Ilara Voss? I know who you are. Dell stepped back from the door. Come in. I made copies of 3 instruments this morning. The clerk Hodges wasn't in until after 10, so I had 2 hours in the annex. Inside, the main room was almost entirely covered in paper. Not chaotically, but with the organized density of someone who worked with documents the way other people worked with tools, every surface allocated to a specific purpose. A long work table held 4 neat stacks of hand-copied pages, each anchored with a smooth river stone. Dell went straight to the second stack. These are the title transfer records for the Northern Valley property. Your mother's land, she said to Rhett, and then held up a hand before he could speak. I know what you're going to ask. Yes, the original registration is there. 1884, Maddox family, primary holder listed as Clara Maddox. The debt instrument the syndicate filed against it has a reference number that corresponds to a credit account opened in March of last year. She set the stack down. The credit account was opened after your mother died. The room was quiet. Rhett stood looking at the stack of papers without touching it. His expression did not do anything dramatic. He just went very still. She died in January, he said, of that year. I know, Dell said, not unkindly. The account was opened in her name in March, 2 months after. She let him have a moment, then continued. Which means the debt claim is not just inflated. It's fabricated against a dead woman's name. That's a different class of fraud. Alara watched Rhett from the corner of her eye. His jaw moved once. Then he picked up the stack and looked through it with the careful, specific attention of someone who had been waiting 14 months for exactly this. She turned to Dell. What about the other families? The pattern I documented? Dell moved to the third stack. I pulled what I could in the time I had. 6 of your 14. The Garcias, the Pruitts, the widow Nakamura, the 3 families in the Red Fork Valley. All 6 show the same structure. Original instruments on record don't match the debt amounts the syndicate filed. In one case, she found a specific page and held it up. The Pruitt family, the original loan was paid off in full in 1889. There's a receipt, but the syndicate filed a continuing debt claim against the same account number as though the payment never occurred. Alara took the page. They kept the account number, used it as if the debt was still open. The records are separated between the original credit institution files and the syndicate's transfer documentation. Most people, most lawyers even, would look at the syndicate's filing and take it at face value. You'd have to go back to the source instruments to catch it, which most people can't access. Dell agreed, because Hodges controls the request process and the index is incomplete. You'd have to know specifically what to ask for. But we know, Alara said. You know. Dell looked at her steadily. The question is what you do with it. We need certified copies, documents that will hold up before a federal marshal. I can make them. I'm a licensed transcriptionist. My copies carry legal weight under territorial statute. Dell glanced at Rhett, who was still reading through the Northern Valley records with a focused quiet. It'll take me most of tonight and tomorrow morning to complete all 14 cases. Hodges is in the office today, so the annex access is closed until he leaves. When does he leave? Usually by 5. He goes to the saloon on the east side. She paused. He also sometimes stays late if there's a shipment of new instruments from the circuit clerk, which there may be today. I heard mention of it. So we may not have the annex until tomorrow. That's the risk. Dell looked at Alara. Where are you staying? I don't know yet. There's a room here. It's not large. She looked at both of them without inflection. There's also a cot in the workroom. That's fine, Alara said. Rhett set the Northern Valley records down. He looked steadier than he had a few minutes ago, but it was the steadiness of someone who has put something aside deliberately, not resolved it. I need to ride through the eastern quarter of town, he said. I want to see where Vara's men are positioned. There are 3 of them that I've seen regularly, Dell said. 2 near the land office, 1 who patrols the main street. They rotate in the evenings. When did Vara's operation come into Harlan specifically? About 8 months ago, after they'd established the pattern in Red Mesa and 2 other county seats. She paused. They're methodical. They set up the legal framework in one county, prove it works, then expand. Which means there are more than 14 families, Alara said. Almost certainly. Alara looked at the notebook in her bag. She had thought of it as evidence of the scope of the problem, and it was, but it was also becoming clear that it was only the piece of the problem she had been able to see from where she stood. The actual scope was larger and probably still growing. "I'll be back before dark," Rhett said, moving toward the door. "Don't go near the land office," Dell said. "I wasn't planning on it." "You were thinking about it." He stopped, looked at her. Something passed between them that had the specific texture of a long acquaintance. Not warmth exactly, but familiarity with each other's particular problems. "I'll stay off the main street," he said, and went. Dell looked at the closed door for a moment, then turned to Alara. "He's going to want to confront Hodges directly at some point." "I know." "Don't let him." "I'm not sure I can stop him." "You're smarter than he is about this kind of thing. He knows it. He'll listen." She moved to her work table and began organizing the papers with efficient, practiced hands. He operates on instinct, and it usually works for him, but instinct and documentation are different tools. What you're building requires documentation. Alara sat down in the chair nearest the work table. "How long have you known him?" 3 years. His mother and I had neighboring properties for 6 years before that, but I didn't know Rhett well during that time. He was elsewhere for most of it." She did not elaborate on the elsewhere. "When the syndicate came against both properties, he came back. He'd been trying to fight it through official channels for over a year before your sale happened." She straightened a stack of papers. "He's not a man who asks for help easily." "I noticed." "He stopped your sale." "I noticed that too." Alara looked at the copies Dell had made, the neat, careful handwriting. "Why did you stay in Harlan after you lost your property?" Dell was quiet for a moment. "Because the evidence was here," she said, "and because leaving felt like letting it finish." Alara understood that answer completely. She spent the rest of the afternoon going through the copies Dell had made, cross-referencing them against the notebook, building a picture of the full documentary record they would need. It was detailed, methodical work, the kind that looked like nothing from the outside and was actually the thing holding everything else together. Dell worked alongside her in a companionable silence that occasionally broke for a question or a clarification, and Alara found herself grateful for a person who worked the same way she did, who understood that the documents were not just evidence but argument. By evening, they had a list of exactly what still needed to be pulled from the archive. 6 remaining family cases, the full chain of title for the Northern Valley property, and 2 instruments that Dell believed existed but had not yet been able to access, involving the original acquisition terms when Vara's syndicate absorbed the Red Mesa Credit Union. "Those 2 instruments are what connects everything," Alara said. "If the acquisition terms include a provision that caps transferred debt at original amounts, then the syndicate violated its own contract. Every inflated claim they filed is void on its face. And if those instruments don't exist, or if they were written to allow the inflation, then we're still documenting fraud, but it's harder to prove the systematic intent." She looked at the list. "Those documents exist. They had to have been registered. An acquisition of that scale requires territorial filing. Hodges may have pulled them from the accessible index. Pulled, but not destroyed. The originals have to be in the archive." She tapped the list. "That's what we need the annex for." Dell had made soup from dried vegetables and salt pork, and they ate at the work table because there was no other clear surface, and the evening came down outside in the dusty purple way of high desert country, and Rhett came back at dusk with the information that 2 of Var's 3 men had been in the saloon when he passed, and that the 3rd had been at the telegraph office. "Sending a message?" Alara asked. "Receiving one." He sat down and accepted the soup Dell handed him. "I couldn't see the content, but the timing, they know we're in the area," Dell said. It wasn't a question. "Henry's people are solid," Rhett said, "but someone talks in every town. We should assume they have general word and not specific." "How much time does that give us?" "A day. Maybe less." He looked at Alara. "What do we still need from the archive?" She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned was how he absorbed detailed information. Total attention. No noise. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. "The acquisition instruments," he said. "Dell, where would they be filed?" "Pre-1890 territorial registrations are in the back section of the archive. Leather-bound ledgers, organized by year and instrument type." Dell poured herself more coffee. "I know exactly where to look. The problem is time. If Hodges stays late tonight, I can't get in until tomorrow morning, and tomorrow morning is the last safe window, Rhett finished. Yes. The three of them sat with that. Outside, the desert had gone fully dark, and somewhere in the direction of the main street, a door opened and closed, and voices carried briefly in the still air and faded. I'll go, Elara said. Both of them looked at her. Dell goes first through the annex, she said. I go with her. If Hodges is there, Dell continues as usual. She has legitimate business. I stay out of sight and work the pre-1890 ledgers while she handles anything that requires her official access. She looked at Rhett. You stay outside. Not because you're less useful inside, but because if someone recognizes you near the land office, everything falls apart before we get what we need. Rhett's expression moved through something that was not quite objection and not quite agreement. She's right, Dell said. Your face is the problem, not your capability. I know she's right, he said. He looked at Elara with a directness she was getting used to but hadn't fully gotten used to. You know what you're looking for? As well as Dell does. If Hodges comes in while you're in the back section, then I leave through the surveyor's annex and we meet at the south edge of town. She had already worked through it. Dell, is there a window in the back section that faces the alley? Small one, north-facing. If I need to signal you, if something changes inside, I'll put a piece of paper in the window frame. Dell nodded. I'll watch for it. Rhett looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. You've done this kind of work before. Not the archives specifically, but the being in a space where you're not supposed to be. It wasn't quite a question. My father had a neighbor, she said, who had a habit of moving fence posts. In the middle of the night, a few inches at a time. Over a year, he'd moved them about 6 feet onto our land. She paused. I documented it. Surveyor's measurements at night, over 3 months. Brought it to the county land office myself. How old were you? 17. He held her gaze for a moment. What happened to the neighbor? He moved the fence posts back. She picked up her copy of the document list, and then he moved away, which was the better outcome. Rhett almost smiled again. It was becoming a thing she looked for without deciding to. The plan held as long as Hodges behaved predictably, and Hodges, as it turned out, did not. He left the land office at 5:30, which was earlier than usual, which should have been a relief, but he came back at 7:15, which Dell spotted from her window and which sent her out the back door of her house at a pace that was not quite running to find Elara already geared up and waiting in the alley. He's back, Dell said. I know, I saw the light come on. Elara looked down the alley toward the land office. How long does he usually stay when he comes back late? Half an hour to an hour. He does end-of-day logging. Can we wait him out? Dell considered. If he leaves before 9, yes. The night is dark enough after 9 that movement near the annex gets harder to see. Then we wait. They went back inside. Rhett was at the table reading through the Northern Valley records again, with the concentrated attention of a man cross-referencing things he already knew against things he was only now seeing in documentary form. He looked up when they came back in. Hodges, Elara said. I saw the light. He set down the papers. How long? We don't know. We're waiting. He nodded, went back to the records. Then, without looking up, he said, in the 1884 registration for the Northern Valley property, my mother's name is listed as primary holder. My name is listed as secondary. Elara and Dell both looked at him. I didn't know that, he said. I thought it was solely hers. She registered you as secondary holder when you were, what, a child? Dell asked. I would have been 12. A pause. She didn't tell me. Another pause. I found out she was sick about 6 months before she died. I came back. She didn't mention the registration. Dell said nothing. Elara looked at the papers in front of him. It means the debt claim is even less defensible than we thought, she said carefully. A secondary holder's consent is required for certain debt instruments under territorial law. I know what it means legally. He set the papers down carefully, the gesture of someone being precise about handling something. She put my name on it. He looked at the table for a moment, then at Elara. She knew I'd come back eventually. The room held that. Nobody filled the silence with something smaller than it was. After a while, Dell stood up. "The light's off in the land office," she said. Alara picked up the document list. "Let's go." The annex door opened without sound, which was either good luck or Dell's preparation, and probably both. Dell went first, moving through the surveyor's workroom with the practiced ease of someone who had done it before, around the drafting table, past the tall flat-file cabinets, through the interior door that connected to the land office's back corridor. Old Fitch's workspace smelled like paper and linseed oil, and the particular dry dust of stored maps, and he had left a single candle burning on his table, which Dell said was his way of saying the path was clear without having to say anything at all. Alara followed close, carrying the document list in one hand and a small tin lamp in the other, the flame turned low enough to be nearly nothing. She had a revolver on her hip and tried not to think about it. The land office's back corridor was narrow and smelled less pleasant than the surveyor's space. Something chemical, ink or preservative, the smell of documents stored in quantity. Dell moved left without hesitation, toward the front of the office and the current year files, her domain and her cover. Alara moved right, toward the archive section, where the leather-bound ledgers went back to the territory's earliest registration years. She found the pre-1890 section by the year markers on the spines. They were large books, wider than they were tall, the kind of volume that required both hands, and suggested the territorial government had taken the permanence of land records seriously, even when it had not taken much else seriously. She ran her fingers along the spines until she found 1887, then 1888, then the acquisition year she needed. The acquisition of the Red Mesa Credit Union by Vare's syndicate had been registered in territorial records in the spring of 1890. She pulled that ledger first and set it on the narrow reading shelf along the wall, and turned the lamp up just enough to read. The registration was on page 43. She found it in under 2 minutes, which was faster than she expected, and for a moment she just looked at it. The formal language of territorial commerce, the printed form with handwritten entries, the syndicate's name in a clerk's careful script. Colton Vare, Principal. Western Territorial Land and Credit Syndicate. Acquisition effective. March 14th, 1890. Then she found the provision she was looking for. It was in the third paragraph of the acquisition terms, subclause 4, and it was written in the dense contractual language that was designed to be unread, which was probably why Vare had assumed it would stay that way. Transferred debt obligations shall not exceed original instrument amounts as recorded at the time of account issuance. She read it twice. She had been right. The syndicate's own acquisition contract capped the transferred debts at original amounts. Every inflated claim they had filed since March of 1890 violated the terms under which they had acquired the right to make any claim at all. Her hand was not entirely steady when she copied it. She worked through the remaining cases methodically. The 6 family files they still needed, the full chain of title for the Northern Valley. The Pruitt paid-off receipt was in the 1889 ledger, exactly where it should have been, untouched, which meant Vare's operation had been counting on the separation between the original files and their own documentation to make the discrepancy invisible. It had worked for 2 years. It required someone to come in here with a specific list and look for specific things to stop working. She was 40 minutes into the archive when she heard voices in the front of the office. Not Dell's voice, a man's. Then Dell's, calm and professionally even, the voice of someone who has been interrupted at legitimate work and is not surprised by it. Alara turned the lamp down to nothing and stood very still. "Didn't expect anyone in here this late," the man's voice said. "I'm behind on the Morrison transcription," Dell said. "I told Mr. Hodges I'd need evening hours this week. He approved it. He didn't mention it. I don't imagine he mentions everything to everyone." A pause. Footsteps moving around the front of the office. Alara could see, through the crack in the archive door, the edge of lamplight shifting. "What are you working on?" the man asked. "Current year deed transfers. The Morrison family's property consolidation. They've been buying out neighboring parcels, and the documentation needs to be legible for the county record." Dell's voice was perfectly steady. "Do you need to verify? I have the authorization slip in my case." Another pause. Alara pressed her back against the ledger shelves and breathed slowly. "No," the man said. "Just checking." "Of course." The footsteps moved again. The edge of lamplight stilled. Alara waited. When the front door closed, she let out a breath that had been waiting in her chest for approximately 2 minutes. She gave it 5 more minutes before she turned the lamp back up, finished the last 2 cases on her list, closed the ledgers in the order she had found them, and moved back through the corridor to where Dell was standing at the transcription table with a document in front of her that she had not been reading. "Bounty man," Dell said quietly. "One of Vare's, not the regular patrol." "I heard." "He'll come back." "I know." Alara held up the copied pages. "I have everything." Dell looked at them, then at her. Something in Dell's face that was not quite relief and not quite surprise, but somewhere between them. "The acquisition terms?" "Subclause 4, debt cap provision. It's all there." Dell took the pages and looked at the top sheet for a long moment, reading the provision. Her jaw tightened once, then released. 2 years, she said. "I've been in this office 24 times over 2 years, and I never thought to go back to the acquisition registration." "You didn't know what to look for." "You did." "I had my father's loan note and a lot of time to be angry," Alara said. "It clarifies what you look for." They went out through Fitch's annex, closing the door behind them, and moved through the alley back toward Dell's house. The night was dark and cold in the way that high desert nights went cold without warning, the temperature dropping 20 degrees from where it had been at sunset. Rhett was waiting at the corner of the alley where he had said he would be, which she had not doubted but was nonetheless glad of. He looked at her face when she came out of the dark, and whatever he read there made his shoulders drop half an inch. "Got it?" he asked. "All of it," she said. They were back at Dell's table by 10 o'clock, and for the next 2 hours the three of them built the case document by document, the copies organized into a sequence that told the story clearly enough that a federal marshal could follow it without needing explanation. Dell's handwriting was small and exact. Alara's annotations in the margins were precise, cross-referencing each piece to the notebook entries where the pattern had first been identified. It was good work, the kind that held up. Rhett sat with the Northern Valley records separate from the rest, not building argument, just reading. Alara let him be. Around midnight, Dell set down her pen. "There's something I haven't said." Alara looked up. "The bounty man tonight. He wasn't checking on the office." Dell folded her hands on the table. "He was looking for specific people. I know him. His name is Carver. He's been working for VAR for about 6 months. He doesn't do routine checks. He's a tracker." "He's looking for us specifically," Rhett said. He had been listening without appearing to. "I think Vare knows you're in the area, not just in general. He may know you're in Harlan." Dell looked at both of them. "You need to move tonight." "We can't move without the certified copies," Alara said. "I can certify them in an hour." Dell was already pulling out the official transcriptionist seal from her case. "I'll work fast, but you need to be out of Harlan before dawn." "Where do we go?" Rhett asked. "Thibodeau is still 2-3 days out." "There's a way to move him faster," Dell said. She reached into the case again and produced an envelope, sealed. "I wrote to the marshal's office 6 weeks ago about the pattern. I didn't hear back, which means either the letter didn't arrive, it was intercepted, or Thibodeau decided it wasn't enough to act on without corroboration." She held up the envelope. "This is a second letter, with a summary of what you found. If you can get it to the relay station at Cutter's Fork, it's on the main east-west road, about half a day's ride north. They have a direct telegraph line to the marshal's office in the capital." Alara looked at the envelope. "You've been building this longer than we have." "I've been building what I could from where I was." Dell set the envelope on the table between them. "This is the part I couldn't do alone. Getting the evidence out of the archive and corroborated by someone who can testify to its collection." "You can testify." "My testimony alone won't hold. VAR's lawyers will argue I fabricated the copies. You need multiple witnesses to the document collection and the chain of custody." She looked at both of them. "The two of you, plus the original instruments still in the archive, plus the certified copies, that's a case." Rhett picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his hands. "There's a problem," he said. Alara had been waiting for it, the same thought she had been sitting with for the past hour. "The 30-day provision," she said. He nodded. "We have the evidence. But to trigger the fraud provision and void the proceedings, including Alara's debt claim, it has to be presented before a legal officer of the territory within the 30-day window. He looked at Dell. Thibodeau needs to receive the letter, ride out, and reach us before day 28. We're on day 6. The telegraph is faster than a rider, Dell said. If Thibodeau can telegraph an acknowledgement of the fraud claim to any territorial legal officer, that may satisfy the provision. May, Alara said. May, Dell agreed. The statute's language is not perfectly clear on remote acknowledgement, but it's an argument. The three of them sat with that uncertainty for a moment. It's what we have, Alara said. We go to Cutter's Fork, we send the telegraph, we find Thibodeau. And if Carver finds us first, Rhett said. Not a question, just naming it. Then we deal with that. She looked at him directly. One thing at a time. Dell certified the copies in 58 minutes, which was not fast enough to be careless and was impressively fast for the volume of material. She worked in silence, stamping and signing each page with the particular authority of someone who understood that the signature meant something, that it was not just procedure, but commitment. When she handed the sealed document packet to Alara, she held it for a moment before releasing it. If this works, Dell said. When it works. Dell almost smiled. When it works. I want the Northern Valley property on the restoration list. It's already on it, Rhett said from across the room, and the flatness of his voice said that this was not generosity but certainty, that he had put it on the list in his own head before anyone asked him to. Dell looked at him. Your mother would have liked this version of you. He didn't answer that, but the silence after it was not the closed-door kind. They left Dell's house at 2 a.m. with the certified copies in Alara's saddlebag, wrapped in the waterproof oilcloth with her father's original loan note, the sealed telegraph letter on top. Cursa picked up the cold night air and moved with more energy than usual, which was the mayor's equivalent of approval. The road north toward Cutter's Fork ran parallel to the canyon wall for the first 3 miles, which gave good cover on the eastern side, but made the western approach open, visible in the moonlight in a way that was uncomfortable. Alara kept Cursa close to the canyon face and watched the plain to the west without making it look like watching. They had been riding for perhaps 40 minutes when Rhett said quietly, "Don't look left." She didn't. Ryder, moving parallel, about a quarter-mile west. He kept his voice level. Came out of the hollow south of the last bend. He's been matching our pace. Carver, or one of Var's other men. The timing fit. If someone had watched Dell's house and seen them leave, and the syndicate's riders knew this road, they would have moved to cut off the northern route rather than chase directly. How long until the canyon wall breaks, she asked. About a mile. There's an open stretch of maybe half a mile before the next rock formation. If we're going to run, we do it before the open stretch. We're not running, he said. Not yet. He paused. There's a side cut about 200 yards ahead, goes up into the canyon and comes out on the ridge. I've been through it once. It's narrow and rough, but it gets above the plain. He'll see us go in. Yes. Then he'll know where we are. He already knows where we are. The question is whether he wants to follow us into a canyon cut in the dark or wait for reinforcements on the plain. Alara thought about it. A lone rider waited for reinforcements. A rider with orders to stop them moved immediately. How long to the ridge from the cut? 20 minutes, maybe less. From the ridge, there's a northwest track that comes back down to the Cutter's Fork Road on the far side of the open stretch. Then we go up. Yeah. He glanced west once, brief and calibrated. The cut's going to come up fast. When I move, follow exactly where I go. Don't give Cursa her head. She'll want to slow on the incline, and she can't. I know my horse. Right. He looked ahead. Now. The turn into the cut was abrupt, a gap in the canyon wall that was barely wider than a horse, marked by nothing except that Rhett knew it was there. Alara felt Cursa's hesitation, the reluctant gathering of hindquarters, and she closed her legs and kept her hands quiet, and the mare went in. The incline was bad. Not dangerous if you rode it right, but the kind of terrain that required constant correction. Footing that shifted, rocks that moved under hoof weight, the trail switching back twice in the first 100 yards. Rhett was 4 lengths ahead, and she followed his horse's movement as a guide, adjusting where he adjusted, giving Cursa the rein she needed to figure out her own feet. Behind them, she heard the Western rider change pace, accelerating toward the cut. "He's coming in," she said. "I hear him." The trail switched back a third time and the incline steepened, and Cursa was breathing hard now, the honest work of it, and Alara's thighs were burning against the saddle. The canyon wall rose on both sides and the moonlight disappeared into a narrow strip overhead, and the dark was close and textured and real. They came out onto the ridge with a suddenness that felt like surfacing. The night opened up above them and the plain spread west and north, and she could see from this angle the full geometry of the landscape, the canyon system below, the road they had been on a thin pale line in the dark, and to the west, 2 more riders now, converging from a direction that suggested they had been positioned and waiting. Not 1 man. 3. Rhett saw it at the same time. He pulled his horse up and looked north along the ridge. "They knew the road," she said. "They knew it." He scanned the ridge. This wasn't Carver tracking us out of Harlan. This was already in position. Which means Vare knew we were here before tonight. Before tonight. He looked at her. The moonlight was enough that she could see his face, the thing that moved through it. Not fear exactly, but a recalibration. He had thought they were a step ahead. Now he was doing the arithmetic on whether that was still true. "The telegraph letter," she said. "That's the only thing that matters right now. Everything else we can deal with if Thibodeau has the information. If we get to Cutter's Fork, then we get to Cutter's Fork." She looked north along the ridge. "Does this track hold?" "For about 2 miles, then it drops back down." "Can we stay on it long enough to come out ahead of those 2 riders?" He looked at the western plain, at the positions of the riders, running the geometry. "Maybe. It depends on how fast they move on open ground versus how fast we can move on the ridge. Cursa is fast on open ground. So is yours." "Yeah." He turned his horse north. "Stay close." They moved along the ridge at a pace that was too fast for the footing and not fast enough for the urgency. Alara kept Cursa half a length behind Rhett's horse and watched the plain below, tracking the 2 western riders as they moved north, trying to read the angle of their approach against the rate of her own progress. Behind them, in the cut, she could hear sounds that suggested Carver had decided to follow after all. The canyon walls threw noise around in ways that made distance unreliable, but he was in the cut, which meant he was moving slower than they had been. The ridge track dropped away from the canyon wall after a mile and traversed a section of open rock that was exposed to the plain. She held her breath through it. The riders below had not looked up, or if they had, the angle in the dark had been enough. Then the track curved northeast, and the canyon wall came back in, and below and ahead she could see, perhaps half a mile north, the lights of Cutter's Fork. "We make it," she said. "We make it to the station," Rhett said. "Getting the telegraph out is the next problem. One thing at a time." She heard him make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite agreement, but was somewhere between the two. And they rode hard down the last descent toward the lights, and the sealed envelope in her saddlebag did not move, and the cold air came off the canyon in waves, and Alara Voss thought about a subclause in an acquisition contract, and a dead woman's name on a dead instrument, and a man who had found out at midnight that his mother had put his name on a land registration 30 years ago because she knew he would come back. And she thought that the world was full of the kind of evidence you only found when you were looking for something else entirely. The relay station at Cutter's Fork had 1 operator on the night shift, a young man named Artis, who was 19 and visibly startled by 2 armed riders coming through his door at 4 in the morning. He looked at the letter Dell had written, then at Alara's face, then at Rhett, and he made a decision that Alara thought was probably the bravest thing that young man had ever done. "I can get this out in 10 minutes, he said. "Do it," she said. He sat down at the telegraph key, and the room filled with the rapid, precise sound of the instrument, and outside the canyon was quiet, and they waited. Artis sent the telegraph at 4:17 in the morning and received an acknowledgement from the marshal's office at 4:41, which was fast enough that Alara suspected someone was already awake at that end for reasons unrelated to them. The acknowledgement was brief. Message received. Thibodeau en route east. Estimated arrival. Red Mesa crossing area, day after tomorrow. Hold position if safe. Do not engage syndicate forces directly. Rhett read it over her shoulder. Day after tomorrow, he said. That's day 8 of 30. I know the count. He straightened up. Hold position means stay out of sight, which we can't do in Cutter's Fork. The relay station had one room and a horse pen and no cover if Vara's riders came through the main road, which they would before sunrise if Carver had regrouped after the canyon cut. Artis was already looking at the door with the expression of someone who wanted to be helpful and was beginning to calculate the cost of it. Is there somewhere north of here we can wait? Elara asked him. Old survey camp about 4 miles up the canyon road, he said. Nobody uses it anymore. There's a cistern, so water's good. Anyone know it's there? People who've been in this area a while. He paused. Var's men are mostly from outside the territory. Brought in. She looked at Rhett. It's something, he said. They thanked Artis and left before first light, moving north on the canyon road with the darkness still heavy enough to be useful. Elara's legs ached from the ridge riding, and Curse's stride had a slight flatness to it that said the mare was tired, but not spent. They moved without talking, the kind of silence that came after a decision had been made and before the next one was required. The survey camp was where Artis had described, a low stone shelter with a collapsed lean-to on one side and a cistern that was 3/4 full of clean water. Someone had been through recently enough that the fire ring had ash that hadn't blown away yet, but not recently enough to be concerning. They watered the horses and ate the last of the food Dell had packed them, and Elara spread the certified copies on the flat rock outside the shelter and went through them again in the early gray light, building the sequence in her mind, checking the argument for gaps. Rhett sat on the cistern wall and watched her. There's something you haven't said, she told him without looking up. There are several things I haven't said. The one that matters right now. He was quiet for a moment. If Thibodeau arrives on day 8 and we present the evidence, the fraud provision voids your debt claim. Your homestead is safe. He paused. But voiding a debt claim is not the same as prosecuting the syndicate. Thibodeau can acknowledge the fraud and open an investigation, but Vare's operation doesn't collapse overnight. He has lawyers. He has contacts in the territorial government. He'll delay, challenge the evidence, file counter-instruments. I know that. And during the delay, he has 14 families who are still vulnerable, the ones whose claims haven't been formally voided yet. He could move against any of them while the case is pending. She set down the papers. So we need more than a marshal's acknowledgement. We need a public confrontation, something that puts the evidence in front of people who can't unsee it. The affected families, witnesses, people Var can't threaten into silence all at once. He looked at her. Red Mesa Crossing, the town that watched your sale. Driscoll comes back on day 30 for the proceeding. If we're there, with Thibodeau, with the certified copies, in front of everyone who is standing on that street, it becomes public record, she said. Not just a federal filing, a witnessed public exposure. The frontier code that most people operate under, including a lot of Var's own hired men, it has limits. What you can do in a back room or on a document no one reads is different from what you can do when 300 people are watching. He held her gaze. If we expose it publicly, some of those people will break from him, not out of courage, just out of self-preservation. And if Vara decides to stop us before we get to that confrontation, then we deal with that between now and day 30. He said it without drama, just placement. She looked at him for a long moment. He was sitting on a stone cistern wall in a ruined survey camp after a night of canyon riding, and before that 2 days of hard travel, and he looked exactly as tired as that should make a person look, which was to say tired but functional. She had noticed over the past several days that he operated without the quality many men had of constantly performing their own competence, the unnecessary readiness, the watching to see if someone was watching. He was just there, doing what was needed, and that was more reassuring than she would have expected from someone whose reputation was entirely built on violence. You've been planning the Red Mesa confrontation since before we left, she said. Since the auction, he said. Maybe before. Before. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I'd been watching Red Mesa for 3 months before your sale, watching the pattern develop there. I knew Var was going to move on a visible target, someone whose debt claim would make a statement, scare the rest. He looked at the horizon. I didn't know it was going to be you. But you knew it was going to be someone. Yes. And you came anyway. I came to watch, to see if there was a way to use it. He looked back at her. That's not a flattering thing to say. No, she said, but it's honest. She held his gaze. You stopped the sale. What I thought was, if I could interrupt the proceeding, introduce enough legal uncertainty to buy time, and if whoever they targeted had put together any kind of evidence of their own, you were looking for someone else who'd been working the problem. I was hoping for it. And I had the notebook. You had more than the notebook. He set down the cup. You had the acquisition terms. That was the piece I hadn't been able to reach. Alara thought about standing on the auction platform looking at 300 silent faces, the leather notebook in her pocket, calculating evidentiary strategy while Driscoll read out a debt that didn't exist. She thought about what it had felt like to be that certain of the problem and that uncertain of the solution, and she thought it was one of the loneliest feelings she had encountered. We should sleep, she said. A few hours before we start back south. Agreed. She gathered the papers and put them back in the oilcloth sleeve, tucking it into the saddlebag inside the shelter where it would stay dry. She lay down on her bedroll and was almost immediately in that shallow, alert sleep that conditions of ongoing risk produced. Not rest exactly, but repair. She woke 3 hours later to the sound of Rhett already up, the horses re-watered and his gear packed. The sun was fully up and the canyon was warm, and the light had that particular clarity of high desert mornings that made every rock formation look like it had just been placed there. We go back through the Callahan corridor, she asked, packing her own gear. Faster to take the main road south. Thibodeau will be coming up from the east. We might cross paths if we move right. The main road is watched. It was watched 2 days ago. Var's men have been moving. They'll be covering the canyon routes now, looking for where we went. He tightened his saddle. The main road is a calculated risk, as opposed to the ridge at midnight. That was also a calculated risk. You seem comfortable with those. He looked at her over his horse's back. I'm not comfortable with them. I'm just not stopped by them. She mounted up. There's a difference. Yeah, he said. There is. They took the main road south, Dad. The first hour was quiet in a way that felt provisional rather than safe. The landscape doing nothing unusual. No riders on the horizon, no dust plumes from the direction of Harlan. Alara kept the saddlebag close and watched the road ahead and thought about the Red Mesa confrontation and everything that had to go right for it to work. Thibodeau arriving on schedule was one piece. The weather holding was another. The eastern approach to Red Mesa had a wash crossing that flooded in hard rain, and the season was unpredictable. Vare not moving on the remaining families before day 30 was a third. Driscoll actually showing up for the scheduled proceeding rather than finding a reason to delay was a fourth. And the thing Rhett had not yet fully said, whatever secret identity he had been protecting, whatever piece of himself he had been keeping behind a door she had not pushed on. She could feel the shape of it. Something about who he was in the territory, something that would change how people in Red Mesa received his accusation. He had said, the day of the auction, that the only way to expose the truth was to reveal a secret identity he had protected for years. She had not pressed on it because pressing had not felt like the right tool at the time, and partly because she was not sure she was ready for what it changed. She was working up to asking when he said, without preamble, "My father was a territorial judge." She said nothing, waited. Not Alcott. Before Alcott. His name was Edmund Maddox. He served the Eastern Territory for 11 years. He kept his eyes on the road. He died when I was 18. By that point, he'd made enough enemies that there were 3 active attempts on his life in the last 2 years of his service. A pause. When he died, I was told by 2 separate people in the territorial government that if I continued using the Maddox name publicly, those enemies would come after the rest of the family, my mother included. So you stopped using it. I stopped using it officially, took my mother's family name, used it in all public record, became Rhett Maddox only in contexts where the name meant dangerous rather than targeted. But the property registration. The property was always under Maddox. My mother refused to change it, She said the land was the land and she wasn't going to rename it because someone was trying to frighten her. His jaw moved, which is why the syndicate's fraudulent debt was filed under Maddox. They knew the name. They knew what it meant. What does it mean now? My father's service included a ruling that was never fully implemented, a land reform provision that would have capped syndicate-style acquisitions in the territory. It was challenged, delayed, sent back to the legislature. He paused. It's still technically on the books, unimplemented. If someone with standing raised it, the provision would apply. The provision would apply. He looked at her. Standing requires someone connected to the original ruling, a direct heir, in territorial law. The shape of it came clear. If you identify yourself publicly as Edmund Maddox's son, you have standing to invoke your father's ruling, which predates VAR's entire operation, which means the acquisitions themselves, not just the inflated debt claims, may be contestable. He said it flatly, the way you say something you have been sitting with for a long time. The fraudulent debts get voided by the 30-day provision and the acquisition terms. The syndicate's land control gets challenged by the reform ruling. It doesn't happen overnight, but it doesn't go away either. And you've been protecting this for 14 months. I've been protecting it for 12 years. He looked straight ahead. My mother knew. Dell knows. Nobody else. Why tell me now? Because I'm going to do it in front of 300 people in Red Mesa Crossing in 22 days. And you should know what it means before then. He paused. It means I become a target, directly, publicly. The people who wanted Edmund Maddox dead didn't all go away when he did. Some of them are still operating. Some of them are inside VAR's network. Alara held the road ahead in her eyes and thought about what she was being told, which was not just information, but a kind of trust she had not been offered before by someone she had known for less than a week. When this is over, she said, and the targets shift off of you somewhat, what do you do? What do you mean? With the land, the Northern Valley, what's the plan? He seemed slightly thrown by the question, which was the first time she had seen him thrown. I hadn't gotten that far in my thinking. Your mother registered you as secondary holder because she thought you'd come back, she said. She thought there would be something to come back to. He was quiet for a long moment. The road curved south and the canyon country opened out into wider terrain, the kind of ground that made the sky look larger. I used to run horses, he said. Before all this, there's good grazing in the Northern Valley, water that doesn't dry up in summer. A pause. I don't know, something that's not this. That's enough of a plan for now, she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, which was still true but was becoming less so. And you? The homestead. I know exactly what I'm going to do with the homestead. She said it with a certainty that surprised even her slightly, coming out that clean. My father built it to survive. I'm going to build it to grow. The family's VAR pushed out. Some of them won't have land to go back to. The homestead has room. There are ways to structure it so it works. A cooperative arrangement. Something like that. I haven't worked out all of it. She looked at him. But I know the shape of it. He nodded, and the nod had something in it beyond acknowledgement. They were 4 miles south of Cutter's Fork, which put them roughly 12 miles north of the point where the main road crossed into the more heavily syndicate-adjacent territory when Alara saw the dust, not behind them, ahead and to the left, coming up from the southeast on a converging angle. I see it, Rhett said. 2 riders, moving with purpose, not patrol, the kind of movement that knew where it was going. Too fast for casual, she said. Yeah. Vares? He watched the angle for a moment. Not the way they ride. That's rangeland movement, not hired gun movement. He kept watching. I think it's... The lead rider came close enough for detail, and then she could see it too. A leather vest, a particular gray hat, and the red cloth hanging from the saddlebag that Henry Callahan had described as the family signal. Henry, she said. His son, Rhett said, the youngest. The younger Callahan pulled up when he was close enough to talk without shouting. He was perhaps 22, dark-haired, riding with the controlled urgency of someone who had been pushing hard but was not going to waste the arrival on drama. "Vare moved on the Delgado family," he said before any greeting. 3 days ago. Sent men to take possession of the property under the existing lien. He looked at Alara. "And he sent a rider to Red Mesa yesterday with a message for Driscoll. My father has a contact in Driscoll's office. The message said to move the proceeding up, 2 weeks earlier than scheduled." Alara's stomach dropped. "How much earlier?" "Day 15, the young man said. "Not day 30. The three of them sat with that on the open road, and the sky was enormous overhead, and the dust of the Callahan son's hard ride settled slowly around the horse's feet. "He knows we have something," Rhett said. "He knows we got into the archive," Alara said. "Hodges would have found the ledgers disturbed. Vare knows what we pulled, or he can guess." She looked at the sealed document packet in her saddlebag. "He's accelerating the proceeding before Thibodeau arrives, before we can present the evidence in the legal window." Day 15. Rhett did the count. "We have 9 days. Thibodeau was day 8, if nothing delays him." She looked north, then south, then at Rhett's face. "We can't wait for the marshal. We have to get back to Red Mesa now." "And when we get there?" She thought about Driscoll's face on the auction platform, about the 300 people who had stood silent on that street, about Vare's calculation that he could make the evidence irrelevant by controlling the timing. "We make sure," she said quietly, "that by the time Driscoll tries to open that proceeding, there is not a single person in Red Mesa Crossing who doesn't know what is in these documents." They rode hard for 2 days. Not the measured pace of people covering ground carefully. This was the kind of riding that used up horses and people both, the kind you only justified when the math left no other option. They stopped twice to rest the animals, 4 hours each time, and ate what the Callahan boy had brought in his saddlebag, and slept in short, unsatisfying intervals that left Alara more aware of her own exhaustion than rested. On the second night, camped in a dry wash 10 miles north of Red Mesa Crossing, she sat against her saddle and looked at the certified copies by firelight one more time. Not because she needed to reread them, because holding them helped her think. Rhett was across the fire, awake the way he was usually awake. Not restless, just present. "Tell me how it goes wrong," she said. He looked at her. "Walk me through it. Every way this falls apart tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Driscoll has moved the proceeding to morning. We arrive at night, which means we have hours to work with, not days. If Vare's men are already in position in town, and they will be, they'll see us come in and Var gets word. Then we don't ride in together," she said. "I go in from the south, my homestead road. I know every neighbor along that approach, and none of them are syndicate people. You come in from the east after I've had an hour." "And the documents?" "I leave them with someone in town tonight. Someone Var has no reason to watch." She thought for a moment. "Martha Price, the laundry woman. She watched the auction and it's been sitting on her. I know it has." "You trust her?" "She sat with my mother through a bad winter." "Yes." She set the papers down. "If Driscoll opens the proceeding and tries to move before Thibodeau arrives, we can't stop it legally. But we can make every person in that crowd a witness before it starts. If the documents are already in the crowd's hands, Var can't make it disappear," Rhett finished. "He can try to discredit it. He can argue the copies, but he can't unknow the crowd." She looked at him. "And then you say what you have to say." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The fire made small sounds between them. Somewhere in the wash, a night bird called once and went quiet. "I've been thinking about what it costs you," she said. "The name. Making it public. I know what it costs. I'm not asking if you know. I'm asking if you're sure." He looked at her directly. "My father spent 11 years building something in the territory. The land reform provision, the anti-syndicate framework. He didn't live to see it implemented, and I spent 12 years not using the name he gave me because I was told it would get people killed." He paused. "It turns out people got hurt anyway, just differently, just more slowly." He set the cup down. "I'm sure." She nodded. "Then we go in at first light, Bottemt." She left him at the wash and rode the south approach alone in the last dark hour before dawn, following the creek road she had ridden her whole life, past the property line markers she knew by feel as much as sight, past her father's gatepost with his name carved into it, Thomas E. Voss, 1881. And she did not stop at the homestead, did not let herself look at the windows she had left dark 11 days ago. She went straight through to the town's south edge. Martha Price answered her door in under a minute, which meant she had not been sleeping well either. She was a stout woman in her late 50s with flower-white hair and the permanently reddened hands of someone who had worked with hot water and lye soap for 30 years. She looked at Alara on her doorstep in the pre-dawn dark and said nothing for a moment. And what moved across her face was not surprise and not guilt, exactly, but the specific expression of a person who has been waiting for something they were not sure they deserved to have arrive. "I need you to hold these," Alara said, and handed her the oilcloth packet. Martha took it. "What's in it?" "The proof that my father's debt was invented, and proof that it happened to 14 other families the same way." She looked at the woman steadily. "When the proceeding starts this morning, I need you to give one copy to Cal Brennan, one to Levi Okafor, and keep one yourself. Pass them into the crowd." "Alara, I know you couldn't stop what happened on that platform," she said, and she meant it without softness, but also without cruelty, just as a fact. "You can do something about what happens this morning." Martha held the packet in both hands and looked at it. "What are they going to do to you and that man when you walk in there?" "I don't know," Alara said honestly. "That's the part I haven't figured out." Martha looked up at her. "Your mother would have done exactly this," she said. "I want you to know I know that." Alara had not expected that, and did not have a clean response for it, so she just nodded and turned back toward the main street. The town of Red Mesa Crossing had the quality, in the early morning before people were fully in it, of a stage set between performances. The buildings all present, the street empty, the silence not peaceful, but waiting. Alara walked her horse to the livery and paid for a stall and brushed Cursa down with the thoroughness of someone who had more time than she knew what to do with, which she did not. But the physical work helped. By 7 o'clock, the street had people in it. By 8, the familiar pre-auction density was assembling in front of the land registry office, and Alara stood in the space between the livery and the feed store and watched it gather. Not hiding, standing in a place where she could see without being the first thing anyone saw. She spotted Driscoll at 8:30, arriving from the east end of the street with 2 of Var's men flanking him and the ledger under his arm. He walked with the confidence of someone who had checked his variables and liked the results. He had not, she was fairly certain, checked all his variables. She did not see Rhett yet, which was either right or wrong, and she could not tell which. Cal Brennan was already in the crowd. She watched Martha move through the assembling people with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had spent her working life in the background of other people's business, and she watched the oilcloth packet open and pages pass from hand to hand, and she watched people read and stop reading and read again and turn to the person next to them. It was not immediate. It moved through the crowd the way temperature moves through water. Gradual, then suddenly everywhere. Driscoll stepped onto the platform at 8:45. He opened the ledger. He began the same formal language he had used 11 days ago. The estate of Thomas Voss, the outstanding claim, the Western Territorial Land and Credit Syndicate. That proceeding is premature. The voice came from the east end of the main street, and it carried, and the crowd turned. Rhett rode in at a walk, which was the right choice. Not the dramatic gallop of 11 days ago, not a performance, just a man arriving with the particular economy of movement that meant he had already decided everything that needed deciding. He stopped his horse in the same open space in front of the platform and looked at Driscoll with the flat gray patience that had stopped the auction the first time. "You moved the date," Rhett said. "That violates the agreement you made in front of 300 witnesses." "The preceding date is at the syndicate's discretion under the 30-day window is a statutory provision, not a discretionary one." Rhett's voice was even. "You don't get to shorten it." Driscoll's face did the calculation Alara had seen it do before. The crowd around the platform was not the same crowd it had been 11 days ago. It was the same people, but something had shifted in the 300 of them. She could feel it, the change that happened when people in a group reached critical mass of knowing something together. Enough of the document copies had moved through the crowd that the balance of information had inverted. They were no longer waiting to see who would win. They were watching to see who would lie. Miss Voss's claim is settled law under the syndicate's registered instruments, Driscoll said, louder now, compensating for something he could feel but not identify. The acquisition terms are clear. The acquisition terms cap transferred debts at original instrument amounts, Alara said. She walked out of the space between the buildings and into the open street and said it clearly enough for the nearest quarter of the crowd to hear it exactly. Subclause 4 of the March 1890 acquisition registration, the syndicate's own contract. She kept walking, steady, until she was standing below the platform looking up at Driscoll. My father borrowed $80. That is the only legal claim the syndicate holds against this estate, not $412. Not with interest. $80, which I will pay, in front of everyone here, the moment you show me the original instrument. Driscoll's jaw worked. The territorial court doesn't have jurisdiction over a fraud claim that predates the proceeding, she said. The 30-day provision does, and we have documentation. She looked out at the crowd and saw, in the hands of people she had known her whole life, the copies Dell had certified. So does everyone else here. One of Vare's men on the platform moved his hand toward his belt. I wouldn't, Rhett said. Just that. No volume, no threat in the voice, just the two words and the absolute absence of doubt behind them. The man's hand stopped. Driscoll turned to confer with the second syndicate man, the taller one with the red mustache, and Alara could see the calculation happening in real time. The crowd, the documents already in circulation, the two deputies at the far end of the street who had taken 4 deliberate steps closer to the platform in the past 2 minutes, and whose thumbs were no longer hooked in their belts. She had wondered about the deputies. Whether 11 days of watching the crowd change had moved them. Whether knowing what was in the documents would be enough, or whether they needed the crowd's weight behind it. She had her answer. Rhett dismounted. He walked to the base of the platform and looked up at Driscoll and the assembled syndicate men, and then he turned to face the crowd, which was the moment Alara had been waiting for, the moment she had known was coming without knowing all of what it would contain. My name is Rhett Maddox, he said. My father was Edmund Maddox, territorial judge of the Eastern District from 1878 to 1889. Some of you know that name. Some of you know what it means that I'm saying it out loud. The crowd was very quiet. In 1889, my father issued a land reform provision that was supposed to limit exactly the kind of syndicate acquisition that Colton Var has been running in this territory for the past 2 years. That provision was challenged and delayed. It was never implemented. He paused. It was never repealed either. It is still on the territorial books, and as the direct heir of the issuing judge, I have standing to invoke it. There was a sound in the crowd that was not quite a sound, more like the collective adjustment of several hundred people's understanding of a situation. The Western Territorial Land and Credit Syndicate's acquisition of regional credit institutions is challengeable under the reform provision, Rhett continued. Not just the debt claims, the acquisitions, which means every piece of land they have claimed or are currently claiming through that mechanism is subject to federal review. He looked at Driscoll. Including this proceeding, including every other proceeding they have opened or plan to open in this region. Driscoll was very still. From the east end of the street came the sound of horses, not one rider, not two. The sound of a group moving at a formal pace, the particular cadence of official travel. The crowd shifted to look, and through the space they opened came 4 horses, and on the lead horse was a heavy-set man in a dark coat with a U.S. Marshal's badge that caught the morning light. Thibodeau had made good time. He pulled up at the edge of the crowd and read the situation the way a man read situations he had been reading for 20 years. Fast, complete, without asking for a summary. His eyes went to the platform, then to Rhett, then to Alara, then to the papers in the crowd's hands. Who has the certified documentation? He called out. I do, Alara said. She pulled the original packet from her coat and held it up, and Thibodeau dismounted and came through the crowd to where she was standing, and she gave it to him, and he opened it and read the first 3 pages with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. He looked up at Driscoll. This proceeding is suspended pending federal review of the syndicate's acquisition instruments. He turned to his deputy. Take the names of every syndicate representative currently on that platform. Driscoll stepped back. The tall man with the red mustache took 1 step toward the edge of the platform, looking at the crowd and then at the platform edge, and then at the two deputies who were now no longer at the far end of the street. "Don't," one of the deputies said, and the quiet authority of it was the voice of a man who had been waiting 11 days for an excuse to use that word. It held. The arrest took the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. Driscoll, the two syndicate men, and a circuit clerk whose name Alara had suspected for weeks. Thibodeau's deputies moved through it efficiently and without theater, which was somehow more final than drama would have been. The ordinary machinery of consequence, unremarkable and unavoidable. Colton Varr himself was not in Red Mesa Crossing that day. He was in the territorial capital, 3 days' ride east, and when the telegraph reached him in the late afternoon with the news from Red Mesa and the simultaneous notification from the marshal's office regarding the Maddox reform provision, his lawyers began requesting postponements before the ink was dry. They kept requesting them for the better part of a year. But the syndicate's control over the region collapsed in the days immediately following the Red Mesa confrontation, the way those things collapse, not with a final blow but with a cascade of smaller failures. The hired men stopped showing up when the payments stopped coming. The corrupt clerk who had been managing the index resigned. The court dates that had always been mysteriously unavailable became available. Judge Alcott, whose illness had been of the diplomatic variety, recovered with surprising speed once it became clear which direction the territory was moving. The Delgado property was returned within a month. The other families followed over the next 2, each case requiring its own paperwork and its own proceeding, and Alara was at most of them, not always at the front of the room, sometimes in the back, with the notebook and the certified copies, and the patience of someone who had learned that this kind of work was less like a battle and more like a repair, steady and deliberate and longer than you wanted. Dell came up from Harlan for the first round of restitution hearings and stayed 3 weeks, and her testimony about the document collection and chain of custody held up through every challenge Var's remaining lawyers attempted, because it was exactly what it claimed to be: careful, complete, and true. Henry Callahan attended the final hearing as a witness, bringing his youngest son, the one who had ridden hard to find them on the main road north. The Delgados sat in the front row. By that point, there were 4 other families present whose names Alara had not originally had in the notebook, people who had heard about the case and come forward with their own debt notices and their own original instruments, and the pattern extended farther than she had initially mapped. It almost always does. Alara's homestead was repaired by the end of summer, not restored to what it had been, repaired to something different, which was not worse. She hired 2 of the displaced families to work alongside her through the first season, a formal arrangement with clear terms and a share of the income, the kind of structure her father would have examined carefully and then approved, she thought. By the second season, there were 3 families, and by the third, the cooperative arrangement she had sketched in her mind on a canyon road north of Cutter's Fork had a name and a set of written agreements and a reputation in the region as the kind of place that did not fail quietly. She kept her father's name on the gatepost. She added her own below it. She found, as the years went on, that the experience of standing on an auction platform in front of 300 people who were not going to help had done something to her that she could not entirely undo and did not entirely want to. It had burned away a particular kind of patience for situations that required waiting for someone else to act. She became, in the territory, the person you came to when the official channels had failed you, when the paperwork was wrong and you could not get anyone to look at it. She was not a lawyer, she said so plainly every time someone asked, but she knew how to read an instrument and she knew how to build an argument, and she knew, from having lived it, that evidence mattered more than fear. It was not a comfortable reputation. It brought its own problems, but it was hers, made from what she had actually done rather than what she had been given, and that was the part that mattered. Rhett did not stay in Red Mesa Crossing. He stayed through the initial hearings and through the first round of property restitutions, long enough to testify twice and to give Thibodeau everything he had on the syndicate's network. The invocation of his father's reform provision moved through the territorial legislature slowly, which was how territorial legislatures moved. But it moved, and the legal record now had Edmund Maddox's name attached to his son's, and that was something that could not be unfiled. In the fall of that year, he went north. The Northern Valley property, restored under the federal review, was in worse shape than the records suggested. 2 years of syndicate neglect had done things to the fencing and the water structures that required serious work. He spent the first winter doing that work, mostly alone, in the way he had spent most of the 14 months before Red Mesa. Not unhappily, but not fully at rest either. He rode south twice before the end of the year. Both times he arrived at the homestead in the evening and left in the morning, and both times the conversation at the kitchen table went later than intended, covering things that were not directly related to property law or syndicate history. Plans, mostly, the specific and unromantic kind, the kind that required pencil and paper and argument about practical details. The kind of conversation that assumed a future. He was not a man who had learned ease. There were things in him that the frontier had worked on for 30 years, and that were not going to soften because the circumstance had changed. He was still quieter than most people needed him to be, still more comfortable with action than explanation, still prone to the flat gray patience that unnerved people who didn't know him and reassured people who did. Alara knew him. Not perfectly. She did not believe in perfect knowledge of anyone, including herself. But she knew the shape of who he was, the way you know terrain you have ridden through in both darkness and light. She knew where the rough ground was. She knew where it was stable. The third time he rode south, he stayed. Not immediately and not without discussion. There was a version of the conversation that was awkward and a version that was honest, and they arrived at the honest version through the awkward one, which was probably the only route. He was not a man who offered things easily, and she was not a woman who accepted things without understanding what they meant, and the negotiation of that took longer than a single evening and was not concluded neatly. But it was concluded. There's a thing that happens in borderland country, in the spaces where official systems fail and the land is hard, and the people who survive in it are shaped by what they have had to do to survive. People build their own versions of order. Not always good versions. The syndicate had been one version, and there were others, and the territory had seen plenty. But sometimes the order that gets built is made by people who have been damaged by the absence of it, and that makes it more durable than the kind that gets handed down. What Alara Voss built at the homestead was that kind. What Rhett Maddox brought to it was the same. They were not easy people, and they did not make it easy, and the families who came to work alongside them, and the cases that came to Alara's kitchen table, and the ongoing correspondence with Dell in Harlan and Thibodeau's office in the capital, none of it was simple, and none of it was finished, and that was fine. Finished was not the point. The point was the work itself. The specific, unglamorous, necessary work of people looking at what is wrong and deciding to document it, to build the argument, to walk into the open street and say the thing plainly in front of everyone and hold their ground while it lands. It does not always work. Alara knew that better than most. She had seen cases go the wrong way, evidence that was not enough, hearings that were bought before they started. She had watched families leave the territory with nothing because the timing was wrong or the official was corrupt, or simply because the machinery of injustice moves faster than the machinery of remedy, and you could not always catch it. She kept a notebook for those cases too. A different one, older now, the cover worn from handling, not for evidence, just for names. Because the other thing she had learned standing on that platform while 300 people found reasons to look elsewhere was that silence is not neutral. It is a choice made under pressure that has consequences as real as any other choice. She did not blame the people who had stood silent that morning. She had seen what VAR had built, and she understood what they were weighing. But she had also seen what happened when 2 people stopped weighing it and simply acted. And she had seen what 300 people did when they were given information instead of isolation. They acted too. Not all of them. Not immediately. Not without the cost that action always carries in places where power is concentrated and fear is well-founded. But enough of them. The way it usually goes, not a tide, just enough. Just the people closest to the thing, reaching out for the next person, and that person reaching for the next. That morning on the main street of Red Mesa Crossing, a woman named Alara Voss had stood on an auction platform with a leather notebook in her pocket and been certain of exactly one thing, that the evidence was real, and that real evidence given to enough people does not go away quietly. She had been right about that. She was still right about it, years later, at a kitchen table covered in paperwork, the gatepost visible through the east window with 2 names carved into it now. the land running out in every direction toward a horizon she had looked at her entire life and still found worth looking at. The work was not done. It was never going to be done. She picked up her pen and continued.